Hey Tony, it's Friday, and first off, to answer your question of the week, I think the war I know most in the modern era would probably be World War II because it was the big one.
It's the one everybody
It's
knows.
the one everyone knows. It's the one that has a million and one different movies made about it, 101 different shows made about it. It's it's so much in our culture, in our cultural mythos, that most people at least know a decent amount about World War II. But it actually led to a discussion between myself, Justice, Jay, and Taylor on what exactly the modern era is.
Well, you say Jay and Taylor. I think they said one thing each.
I mean, they jumped in on the conversation. It was mostly between me and Justice, but it's the term modern era itself is kind of a misnomer because whatever time you're in is by definition modern. But I tend to go more with like a larger historical standby in which the world is basically set off into three different distinct eras, like to where we're at now. And I would actually say we have a fourth.
Wikipedia says four.
Hmm?
Wikipedia says four, which everyone knows you trust Wikipedia.
Exactly.
Wikipedia is the most trustworthy source. Boots approves of this message.
But like the four big eras are antiquity, the ancient times, the classical era, all of which is basically, your Greeks, your Romes, your Mesopotamias, all of that. And that era is believed to have more or less ended with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The next big era is the Middle Ages, the medieval era, the which covers between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and roughly the 1500s, give or take. And that then begins the modern era. Now, the modern era is split up into two distinct parts. There is the early modern period and the late modern period. Now, early modern period covers basically everything from roughly 1500 to roughly 1800 or so, give or take. And then the late modern era covers everything since then. And then the final era, which some people believe in, others don't, I personally find myself believing in it, is what's called the postmodern era. And that is our cyber age that we're in now.
They actually believe the fourth generation of warfare started after the Iraqi War.
Like the War on Terror Iraq invasion or the Operation Desert Storm.
The Iraqi War is what Wikipedia calls it.
Okay.
The U.S. war with Iraq.
So
The blurring of the lines between war and politics, combatants, and civilians, which technically has been taking place throughout all of war.
Well, it's also because historians try and make sense of things that inherently don't make sense because they only make sense because we think they make sense.
War is just a terrible piece of shit, and I am a pacifist.
But I am a firm believer that we're in the postmodern world because our the world we live in now is vastly different than it was in the year 2000. Now, you don't really remember the 90s too well, Tony, considering you were 3 when it ended. But I have distinct memories of the 90s and of the early 2000s. And it is a vastly different world we find ourselves in now than it was then. And it's why I really do believe in the postmodern world that we live in now. The reason why I call it postmodern is because the modern era basically started with the mass production of gunpowder, particularly the global production of gunpowder.
Thank you.
Again, global production, mass production, I consider them more or less one and the same.
The same.
They're used interchangeably.
Only because your people who use them interchangeably are uneducated. People also use figuratively and literally interchangeably, and they're not the same word.
It literally bugs you.
I'm gonna throw a cat on you.
But the postmodern world, the reason why I consider it that way is because much of what we live with now in our digital age is something that couldn't even been dreamed of even 30 years ago, just before I was born. Like, if you would have told mom and dad when they were my age that oh yeah, by the way, in 30 years you're going to have a computer in your pocket that can give you all the knowledge in the world, I'm sure they wouldn't have believed you because it seemed too science fiction. Now we've had computers for decades now. I mean, a lot of the computers that helped us get to the moon were basically like a fraction as powerful as what we have now and a million one times as large. But it's the postmodern era itself really factors in when there's a blurring of lines between politics, war, economics, civilian interactions, surveillance, and all sorts of things that we aren't really in a position to understand right now because it is so new. Now, we've had all of these things like commonplace for 30 years, but in the great scheme of things, 30 years is a really short period of time, and to have as much technological advancement as we've had is just remarkable. And the postmodern era really kind of establishes that, in which you have smartphones, you have home computers, you have traveling computers, you have drone warfare, you have like your defense of a country is both in military strength and in internet strength, in your web defenses and everything like that, because everything is connected to the internet in some way, shape, or form. And it's going to be so strange to see where we're going to be at in 30 years because we've had so much development in those 30 years. Now, one thing I've kind of noticed a little bit is I feel like our development has gone a little less rapidly for about the last 10 years or so.
I mean, that's how these technology eras work. You get a rapid increase in technology, and then it basically gets carrying capacity.
Yeah,
and we start a dark age. And then we once again go back up into the industrial era, and then hit a dark age, and then go back up into an industrial era, etc., etc., etc.
I mean,
welcome to the theory of the human life cycle,
and also just the theory of, the theory of that history repeats itself.
I mean, history does repeat itself
entirely.
There's no
doubt about it. The social cycle theory I'm a firm believer in, as I've mentioned before, but it's kind of interesting to think where we're going to be in another 30 years, because the smartphone has more or less been the same for about 10 years when the iPhone was made. Now it's become better, it's become smaller, it's become more powerful, it's had more memory, but the general concept has stayed mostly the same. And I'm really wondering what the next big step is going to be. Now, there's a certain argument to be made that the way the economy is right now, it's not necessarily furthering intellectual advancements, because we're in very much a stage of the global economy in which it's like, we have these things that work really well, let's mass produce them, and just send them out. Like, they'll get marginally better as we go along, but functionally...
Industrial era with replacement parts, agricultural era with agriculture in general, the Roman era with everything the Romans and Greeks created. History's a cycle.
Almost like the social cycle theory is proven time and time again. But that's a bit of an aside. But no, I'm really interested to see where we're gonna end up in 30 years. And it's gonna be something different to live through. Like, I just think of in mom and dad's life how much technological advancement we've had just in their lives, and I think they're really like, I was born in the age where I remember a time where the internet didn't control everything, but mom and dad were born and lived through a time in which it was around but not common. So the amount of technological advancement that they've gone through in their relatively short lives. I mean, in the great scheme of things, our lives are very short. But in mom and dad's relatively short lives, there's been so much advancement, and it's going to be interesting to see where we end up in the future. So, Tony, my question for you is, do you believe we're in a postmodern era, or do you believe we're in a modern era? Tony, I'll see you on Tuesday. Later, bro.